On February 24, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Since then, more than 14,000 civilians have been killed, 36,000 have been injured, and around 7 million people forced to flee as refugees. In his speeches both before and after the invasion, President of Russia Vladimir Putin repeatedly pointed to NATO's eastward expansion as a fundamental threat to Russia, claiming it was one of the main reasons for the war. But what if it's not the real story? In this video, we will uncover why the Russian war on Ukraine is not really about the NATO. The claim that NATO expansion threatens Russia is not new. Putin and others have been used this narrative for years to justify aggression. In fact, Putin has been repeating it since at least 2007, often pointing back to 1990s. He argues that NATO broke its promise not to expand eastward, but this claim is simply misinformation. Here's what really happened. When Germany was preparing for reunification, negotiations took place under what became known as a 2+4 treaty. The talks involved East and West Germany, France, the UK, the United States, and the Soviet Union. At one point, before the negotiations, US Secretary of State James Baker told the leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, that NATO's jurisdiction would move not 1 inch eastward if Germany unified within NATO. But in context, Baker was only referring to East Germany, meaning NATO forces would not be stationed there. This condition was later written into the final treaty. And indeed, it was respected. Following reunification, NATO combat forces were not deployed in former East Germany. American missiles, which had been stationed in West Germany during the Cold War, were withdrawn. Germany itself has never possessed nuclear weapons or ballistic missiles. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union withdrew its own troops from German territory. Importantly, NATO expansion beyond Germany was never even on the table. As Gorbachev himself later clarified, the topic of NATO expansion was not discussed at all. I say this with full responsibility. Not a single Eastern European country raised it, not even after the Warsaw Pact ceased to exist. Western leaders did not bring it up either. The issue we discussed was ensuring NATO's military structures would not advance in the territory of former GDR. In fact, Gorbachev even suggested that Russia itself might join NATO. And it was not just Gorbachev. In the early 2000s, after Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic joined NATO, Putin himself spoke positively about cooperation with the alliance, even hinting at Russia's possible membership. So, historically, the claim that NATO expansion justifies Russian invasion of Ukraine simply does not hold up. Even Putin's own words from the past contradict it. Which brings us to the real question. If NATO is not the reason, why does the Kremlin keep pushing this narrative so aggressively? The NATO story works perfectly for the Kremlin, both at home and abroad. Let's start with the domestic side. In his speech just before 2022 invasion, Putin painted NATO as a tool of the West, a threat not just to Russia, but to its neighbors and even the entire world. He described NATO as a deceiver that broke its promises, a force trying to finish Russia off and utterly destroy it. He even argued that Western-style democracy humiliates neighboring countries and that only Russia could guarantee their security. The conclusion was clear. Russia had no choice but to act. This was not a one-time message. It was a culmination of decades of propaganda used to justify Russia's action in Georgia in 2008, Crimea in 2014, and the rest of Ukraine in 2022, as well as support for authoritarian regimes and proxy wars in Syria, Libya, and more. In this context, NATO expansion is not a real explanation, it's just a tool, a way to frame Russia as a victim to keep citizens in the constant state of fear and to justify every new invasion as an act of self-defense. This narrative also draws on perceptions from Soviet times when propaganda warned that NATO was coming for Russia. For Russian citizens, the NATO made us do it story removes blame from Putin, simplifies history, creates unity that everyone can rally around the idea of defending Russia from the West, and it also reinforces Russian perceived role in the region. Its people still view neighboring countries as a part of their backyard, ignoring independence and sovereignty of their countries. But the NATO story does not stop at Russian borders. Abroad it resonates powerfully. Parts of the West itself have always been critical of NATO. Strategic thinkers like George Kennan, William Burns, and Henry Kissinger warned that pushing NATO east could provoke Russia and the Russian interest should be prioritized in the region. Realist scholars such as George Mishima and Stephen Walt made similar arguments. However, history shows the flaws of this strategic caution. Before Second World War, the great powers gave Hitler part of Czechoslovakia, trying to avoid conflict, but it only encouraged aggression. Similarly, the West's failure to respond decisively to Russian actions in Georgia in 2008 and in Crimea in 2014 gave Moscow confidence rather than preventing further aggression. These kind of wrong attitudes towards NATO are used by Russian propaganda to mislead Western societies into believing that even Western experts agree Russia started the war because of NATO expansion. These experts have unintentionally become spokespersons for Russian state propaganda. Second, the narrative appeals to very different political camps. On the left, it fits with anti-war, anti-imperialist, and global justice arguments. NATO is aggressive, destabilizing, and provocative. For anti-US militaries, NATO is a link to US-led war in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, and also they are against any security organization. Russia pushes this idea that if NATO provoked the war, the solution is to stop NATO expansion. Empire critics also resonates with them. For them, Western hegemony is seen as a real destabilizer, and Russia framed as a victim. For example, some Western academics and activists like parts of the Stop the War coalition or Noah Chomsky support these ideas. On the right, it fits with populist and sovereignty arguments. NATO is a tool of global liberal elites, undermining national sovereignty, and America should not be dragged into NATO wars. Figures like Nigel Farage or Tucker Carlson have echoed variations of NATO-provoked Putin arguments. This is why the line is repeated by both left-wing peace activists and right-wing populists, often without realizing they are echoing Kremlin talking points. Third, it resonates strongly in the global south, as Russia uses Soviet-era strategies to challenge the West. Many countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America still carry the legacy of Western colonialism and Cold War intervention. NATO, being US-led, is easily cast a continuation of Western imperialism. Russia positions itself as a leader of anti-imperialist front, telling the global south, today NATO threatens us, tomorrow it could be you. Even though this image contrasts sharply with its own history. For centuries, Russia was one of the largest empires in the world, expanding through conquest across Siberia, Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe. It subjugated indigenous people, imposed cultural assimilation, and extracted resources from conquered lands, much like Western colonial empires. The Soviet Union, though officially anti-colonial, also exercised imperial control over Eastern Europe and beyond. These imperial actions are not only a matter of history but are still ongoing, as Russia occupies parts of Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova while exercising coercion and claiming all territories populated by Russian speakers. Russian propaganda portrays the invasion of Ukraine as a step toward ending Western hegemony, claiming Russia is defending sovereignty while the West destabilizes states. Some Russian narratives even compare Ukraine to Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya, or Afghanistan. NATO interventions, however flawed, were framed as a responses to aggression or mass atrocities. Serbia failed to prevent the genocide of thousands of Bosnian Muslims at Srebrenica. Saddam Hussein invaded Iraq's neighboring countries and falsely claimed to possess nuclear weapons. Muammar Gaddafi committed crimes against humanity against civilians during peaceful protests, and Afghanistan served as a base for many terrorist groups. Russian propaganda deliberately ignores these differences. Equating these situations overlooks a central fact. Russia's war is deliberate conquest, seizing Ukrainian territory, targeting civilians, abducting children, and denying Ukraine's very existence as a state. Finally, the power of this narrative lies in its simplicity. The real story of Russian invasion of Ukraine involves ideology, domestic politics, and imperial ambition, complex, multi-layered factors. But Russia invaded because of NATO is a single, clear line. Propaganda thrives on simplicity. NATO is a villain, Russia is defending itself. Kremlin messaging flips the moral burden onto the West. Instead of asking why did Russia invade, people ask why did NATO provoke. For global audiences weary of Western dominance, it's easier to side with the provoked Russia than confront its internal politics. For Russians at home, it makes Putin look like a defender. For foreign audiences, it taps into the real grievances about Western power. For both, it erases the most important actor, Ukraine. By blaming NATO, Ukraine's agency disappears. Ukrainians are no longer the sovereign people making choices. They become pawns in the game between great powers. This erasure is exactly what Kremlin tried to achieve and why the narrative has been so effective for domestic and foreign audiences. As it is now clear, NATO was never the reason, only a cover in Russian propaganda aimed at different audiences. Which leaves us with one question: what is Russia's war in Ukraine really about? At its core, the war is driven by imperial ideology. Putin has long insisted that Ukraine is not a real nation, but an artificial construct, that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. In his essays and speeches, he makes it clear the very idea of independent Ukraine is unacceptable. The war, then, is about erasing the independence and folding Ukraine back into the so-called Russian world. NATO is just a convenient excuse. It's also about overturning the post-Cold War order. For Moscow, the settlement of 1990s was humiliation. Reasserting dominance over its neighbors, especially the largest and most important one, Ukraine, is central to restoring Russian great power status. Losing Ukraine means losing that identity of great power. At the same time, the war serves as a domestic purpose. For Putin, conflict abroad strengthens control at home in several ways. By portraying Russia as a nation under siege, he rallies the population. After every invasion, his approval rating rises. He justifies repression, expanding surveillance, banning social media and messaging apps, prosecuting citizens for online posts about war, and jailing those who criticize the regime. Protests are criminalized, independent media are shut down or forced abroad, and critics of the war are branded as foreign agents or national traitors. Also, sanctions are downplayed, while propaganda reframes hardship as a patriotic sacrifice in the fight against the West. Without external enemies, the Kremlin would have to answer for corruption, stagnation, growing inequality, and falling living standards. War shifts the focus away from these problems and redirects attention to so-called existential threats. For Putin, invasion and war are not only foreign policy, they are tools to strengthen regime control and distract from domestic failures. There is also a deeper fear, not of NATO's missiles, but of Ukraine's success. A democratic, European-oriented Ukraine would show and prove Russians that another neighboring nation, like the Baltic states, can thrive without authoritarian rule. That vision, a free Ukraine, is far more dangerous to Putin than any Western tank. When Putin talks about NATO, what he really means is West itself. The danger is that Ukraine will finally break free from Moscow orbit and integrate politically and economically with Europe. This invasion is not about defense. It's about control. It's about empire, about erasing Ukraine's sovereignty, rewriting Europe's security order, and securing Putin's rule at home. Ultimately, NATO is not the cause of this war. It is merely the convenient antagonist.